Thank you all for coming. The way this session is going to be designed is that Bill's going to give a presentation for 20 to 25 minutes. If you could please hold your questions until that time, and then I'll be moderating questions from the audience. And so we'll leave it to Bill at this point.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting me in this nice tea. Thank you all for coming. I don't know if who knows my story and who doesn't, so I'm going to start at the very beginning for those of you who don't, and I'll make sure that it's not boring. So I'm the author of this book here, Red Notice, for those of you who don't know me. Red Notice is a story about a young American guy who goes to Moscow, sets up an investment fund, falls out with the Russian regime. They murder his lawyer, and then he fights for justice, and that man is me. And so let me, and whenever anyone hears that description, they say, well, how is it this guy with an American accent ended up in this complete crazy story? And so let me start a couple of generations ago. My grandfather was a labor union organizer in Wichita, Kansas in the 1920s. And he was so good at organizing the union that they invited him to New York to organize the National Union. And in New York, there were a bunch of communists running around. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia and check it out? And so in 1927, my grandfather, Earl Browder, moved to Moscow. And in Moscow, he ended up meeting a Russian girl who became my grandmother. And then my father was born in Moscow. And then a few years later, in 1932, he went back to America and became the general secretary of the American Communist Party for the next 13 years. He ran for president twice on the communist ticket in 1936 and 1940 against Roosevelt. And then in 1941, he was imprisoned for being a communist. In 1945, he was then expelled from the Communist Party for being too capitalist. And then in the 1950s, the McCarthy era began, and he was persecuted for being a communist, even though he wasn't a good communist, according to the Communist Party. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964, and when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I said to myself, what's the best way that I could rebel from a family of communists? And I looked around and I thought, I'm going to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. There was nothing that was going to upset my family more than that. We just talked about this a few minutes ago. So in my pursuit of capitalism, I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated Stanford in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was finishing business school, as all other MBA candidates were doing, I was trying to figure out what my next step in life was going to be. And I had this epiphany, which was that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to set out to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. I moved to London and got a job. My first job was with the Boston Consulting Group in London, which is I guess some of you know the Boston Consulting Group. It's a management consulting firm. And I told them I really wanted to work on their Eastern European projects. And one day we got an Eastern European project. We got a project in Poland. And they sent me out to this little village on the Polish-Ukrainian border to help a failing bus factory try to turn around its failing operations. And it was almost an impossible task to turn around this failing bus factory. But while I was sitting in this little town in Poland, I saw an advertisement in the newspaper that they were doing their very first privatizations in Poland. And I had my translator translate some of the documents in the paper just so I understood what it was that they were talking about. And from his translation, I learned that the valuation of the companies, the total value of the companies that were being privatized was roughly 1/2 the value of the earnings in the previous year. So the company was the value of the company was 1/2 of their earnings, meant that all they have to do is stay in business for 6 months and you've effectively made your money back. And I wasn't all that clever a business school student, and so I wasn't an expert on investing, but you don't have to be an expert on investing to know that if you buy a company at 1/2 of 1 year's earnings, then it's probably a good investment. So, and I didn't have a lot of money back then. My total life savings at the time was about $2,000. But I figured if this is what you're from my business school education, I figured this is what you're supposed to do with your money, is put it into situations like this. And so I took my total life savings, my $2,000, I bought these shares in the very first privatization, and they went up 10 times. And I don't know if any of you have ever had an investment that's gone up 10 times, or many of you maybe haven't had any investments at all, but if an investment goes up 10 times, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach. And you want to repeat the experience over and over again as many times as you can. And so from this experience, I decided that I want to be an investor in the privatizations in Eastern Europe. Well, fast forward a few years, and Russia is going through their privatization program. And I'm sitting in Salomon Brothers, which is an investment bank that doesn't exist anymore. It was a famous investment bank back then. It's famous from the book Liar's Poker. And I was working at Salomon Brothers just as Russia was going through its privatization program. And I wasn't an investor at the time, I was an investment banker. And I had my first investment banking assignment to go up and advise a fishing fleet located in Murmansk on their privatization. And so I go up to this town in Murmansk, which is a few hundred miles, I guess you Russian studies people will all know where Murmansk is, a few hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, to visit this fishing fleet to find out what it is they want me to advise them on. And the general director of the fishing fleet meets me at the airplane and takes me to discuss their problems. And he took me down to the ships first, and I got to see what one of these trawlers looked like. And these were these enormous sort of factory ships that go out into the water for 6 months at a time and take fish out of the sea and then stick them in their factories and can them and then bring them back to shore. And I asked him, how many of these ships do you have? And he said, we have about 100. I said, how much do they cost? He said, they cost about $20 million each. So I did the math, 100 times 20 million gets you to $2 billion worth of trawlers. And I said, well, how old is the fleet? He says about 6 to 7 years old. So I just did a rough calculation in my head, thinking, well, that maybe is half depreciated. So they had $1 billion worth of ships. And I said, how much, and he said, well, our dilemma is that we're trying to decide whether to participate in the privatization program. As managers of the company, as the management of the company, we have the right under the privatization program to buy 51% of this fishing fleet. And I said, okay, so at what price can you buy this 51%? And he said $2.5 million. So there's $1 billion worth of ships, and they can buy 51% of the fleet for $2.5 million. And at that point, these secretions in my stomach that I had developed from Poland started coming out again. And I thought, my God, this is unbelievable. If you can buy a company for $5 million that has $1 billion worth of ships, I want to get in on this action. So instead of going back to London, I go to Moscow to figure out what else, to see whether this is an anomaly or whether this is something that's happening more generally in the economy. And I discover, and I go and have a whole bunch of meetings in Moscow with everybody who will talk to me. And I discover that this fishing fleet wasn't an anomaly, that this is going on everywhere. And what the most interesting part of the privatization program in Russia was something they called voucher privatization, where they gave a physical voucher to every person over the age of 18. So they gave out 150 million vouchers. And the vouchers were freely tradable pieces of paper, and they cost about $20 each once they started trading. And so if you did the math, there was 150 million vouchers times $20 per voucher, which meant that there were $3 billion worth of vouchers in circulation. And that was exchangeable for 30% of all the shares of all Russian companies, which meant that the total value of Russia was $10 billion. And to put this in perspective, this is a country with 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel. You name it, they had it. The whole country was $10 billion. It probably should have been 1,000 times that much. And so I went back and I convinced Solomon Brothers that we shouldn't be advising on these, we shouldn't be doing advisory work, we should be investing in these companies. And it was not an easy conversation to have because the moment I mentioned Russia, everybody completely switched off. But eventually I was able to convince Solomon Brothers to allocate $25 million of their own capital to invest in these privatizations. And we invested in the fall of 1993. And about 7 months later, in the summer of 1994, The Economist wrote an article which outlined just that simple math that I've shared with you. And all of a sudden, about 30 people showed up from that Economist article to start buying Russian shares. And our $25 million portfolio turned into $125 million. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted to know how I was such a genius to make this 5 times the money. And so all these salespeople at Solomon Brothers who were in charge of the relationships with their very richest and most powerful clients started to take me around to meetings to all these powerful investors on Wall Street to present this genius young man who had made 5 times my money on Russian shares. And I wasn't a particular genius, I just happened to buy the stuff. So I went around to these meetings, and every single person said, "Can we give you some money to manage?" And so after enough of these meetings, I decided that I was going to leave Solomon Brothers and set up my own company. And I moved to Moscow and set up a company called Hermitage Capital Management to invest in the Russian privatizations. I moved there in 1996, and I had one big investor, a man named Edmund Safra, put up $25 million to be my first investor. And I started out of a little office in Moscow. And eventually, my fund grew from $25 million to $4.5 billion. And I became the largest foreign investor in Russia. The problem was that even though I was managing all this money and it was all very successful and all good, I realized that all the companies I was investing in, I really didn't own a share. I owned shares of these companies, but I didn't really own a share of anything because the people who controlled these companies, the Russian oligarchs, were stealing all the money for themselves. If they had 50% of the company, they were taking 100% of the profits and then some. And so it became clear to me that if I was going to be a responsible investor, I was going to have to start to challenge the stealing that was going on in these companies. And the most famous case involved a company that you've probably all heard of now called Gazprom. Gazprom, at the time when I started to look at it, and it was trading at a 99.7% discount per barrel of oil reserves to BP and Exxon. Why was it trading at such a big discount? Because everybody believed that all the assets were being stolen by the management off of the balance sheet. And so I decided to do something which had never been done before, which was called a stealing analysis of Gazprom. But how do you do a stealing analysis of a Russian company? You can't go and ask the management how much money are you stealing because they wouldn't be very nice to you afterwards. I couldn't go to the investment banks who were specialists in these companies because they were so busy trying to get future advisory work and other stuff from these companies that they would not ever tell me. And so what I decided to do was go and interview anybody who had any knowledge of the stealing and see whether they would share their knowledge with me. And in this process, I discovered something very interesting, which is that during the communist times, the richest person in Russia was maybe 6 times richer than the poorest person in Russia. But then, after this mass privatization, you ended up with these 22 oligarchs controlling 40% of the country and owning 40% of the country. And the richest person in Russia became 250,000 times richer than the poorest person in the country. And so you had this enormous disparity of wealth created very, very quickly. And that made everybody really angry. Made everybody really, really angry. And because almost nobody was participating in this. And so when I was going to ask all these people about the stealing that was going on at Gazprom, people started spilling their guts to me, telling me all these amazing, unbelievable stories. And I was writing down all these notes and filling up all these notebooks. And I wasn't sure how much of this was sour grapes, how much of this was exaggeration, and how much of it was really true. And then we discovered the other very interesting sort of cultural anomaly of Russia is that it's the most bureaucratic place in the world. During the period of Soviet central planning, everything had to be, all data had to be collected and filed with the central planners in Moscow so they could figure out how much electricity in one place and how many eggs in another place and so on and so forth. And even though the Soviet Union ended, all this central planning and all this information gathering and all this bureaucracy was still being collected. And one day, one of my researchers was at a traffic light at Pushkin Square in Moscow. And Pushkin Square is a place where there's enormous traffic jams. And he was at this traffic light, and these kids with the traffic jams sell stuff at the traffic lights. And some kid came up to him selling databases, DVDs with data, or CDs with data on it. And he was looking and said, well, what do you have there? And one of the databases was the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which showed the beneficial ownership of all Moscow-based companies for $5. So he bought this database and came back to the office, plugged it in, and it turned out it was a real database with all this information, and it had a number on it you can call to get other information. And we collected all these databases, and we used that data to then cross-reference all the stuff we had learned from all these breakfasts, lunches, and dinners. And we concluded the most amazing thing about Gazprom, which was that oil and gas reserves over a 4-year period between 1990, or 3.5-year period between 1996 and midway into 1999, the management of Gazprom, nine people, had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. Now, as you probably know, there was a war fought over those between countries. But here's 9 guys who stole this, and we just figured it out. So that kind of makes it understandable why it was trading at such an enormous discount. But the other thing we discovered was that Gazprom is so large, it's 10 times bigger than the oil and gas reserves of Kuwait, which meant that only 10% of the reserves had been stolen, not 99.7, which was how the shares were trading. So we said to ourselves, this is the biggest mismatch between perception and reality that I've ever come across in my life. And so we said to ourselves, we better buy a lot of this stock. And so I made it my single biggest investment. And then I did something totally unusual and unprecedented, which was I took this dossier of information that we had created, and I shared it with the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And they loved it because I saved them months and months of investigative work. And they publicized it, and then it created this enormous political scandal. And about 18 months after I started this process, Vladimir Putin stepped in 2001, and fired the CEO of Gazprom and replaced him with a new guy whose job it was not to steal assets. He could steal cash flow, just no assets. And the share price went up immediately, the next day, 134%. And then it doubled, and then doubled again, and doubled again. And in the end, Gazprom went up 100 times from when we started this campaign. So obviously, I was feeling pretty good about myself. And I thought we should do this in other companies. So we did it at the National Savings Bank, we did it at the electricity company, we did it all over the place. And interestingly, the reason why I was allowed to do this and the reason why it succeeded was that at the time I was doing this was the time that Vladimir Putin came to power. And Vladimir Putin had the same set of enemies that I did. The oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. And his whole job at the very beginning was to reclaim the power that had been stolen by the oligarchs. And in theory, he had said he was going to do this for the benefit of Russia. And so I was very enthusiastic about him. Here he was helping me out with all my fights with these Russian oligarchs. He was going to make Russia a normal place again, and I was getting rich at the same time. It seemed like a great situation. And for about 4 years, it was a great situation. And then in 2003, Vladimir Putin won his war with the oligarchs. He arrested the richest oligarch in the country, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. He arrested him, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial, sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest man in Russia. You see a guy who's far cleverer, far richer, and far more powerful than you, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction? You don't want to sit in your cage yourself. So one by one, the oligarchs went back to Putin and said, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? And Putin came back with a very simple answer, 50%. This was not 50% back to the Russian government or 50% to the presidential administration of Russia. It's 50% to Vladimir Putin. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't prove that it was 50%. It might have been 30, or it might have been 70. It might have been some other sort of quantitative arrangement altogether. What I can prove is that after that, he changed his whole behavior towards the oligarchs. Instead of being adversaries, they became business partners. And as business partners, all of my fights to expose corruption were no longer fights that were convenient for him. They were fights that caused him economic loss. And so it all became clear and painfully obvious to me in November of 2005, after I'd come to London for a weekend trip, and I was going back to Moscow, where at this point I'd lived for 10 years. And I was stopped at the border. I was detained for 15 hours in the airport detention center. And then I was expelled from Russia, deported to London, and declared a threat to national security. Now, when the Russians turn on you, they don't generally do it mildly. They do it with extreme prejudice. And so when I was expelled, I knew that I needed to try to protect all of my interests as best as I could. And so I evacuated my staff. I had an office there, but I just left one person, a secretary, evacuated everyone else to London. And then I quickly and quietly, without anyone knowing, sold all of the securities in my fund. I got everything out, so people and money, and I sort of dusted off my hands. I thought, okay, great. They can't touch me anymore. It's now time to move on. I'm done with Russia. Unfortunately for me, Russia was just getting started with me. And about 18 months after I was expelled, 25 police officers from the Moscow Interior Ministry raided my office in Moscow. 25 more officers raided the office of an American law firm that I used. And they were specifically looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for the investment holding companies through which we had invested all this money in Russia. At the law firm, they found all the money. They seized the documents. If not the money, they found all the documents and all the stamps and seals. They took all these documents away. And the next thing we knew, my firm no longer owns these investment holding companies. They've been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police. At this point, even though there's no economic loss to me, I'm very worried about what else the police might have been up to. And so I hire a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate. Sergei Magnitsky investigates, and he comes back, and his conclusion is pretty shocking. He said, first of all, these guys tried to steal all of your money, but because you had no money there was nothing to steal. And so I said, good. He said, but second of all, when you were selling everything, when we were selling everything, we had a profit of $1 billion, and we paid $230 million of taxes to the Russian government. And he said, those taxes that you paid, these guys went back to the tax authorities, and through a highly complex and convoluted scam, they applied for a $230 million tax refund using your stolen companies. And it was awarded in one day on Christmas Eve, no questions asked. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia. I was amazed. And I thought for sure this must have been a rogue operation. Putin would have surely authorized them to steal my money, but I couldn't imagine him authorizing them to steal the tax money of the Russian government. And so we figured that if we just brought this to the attention of the right people, the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. So we wrote criminal complaints all over and spread them out all over Russia. We publicized this in the newspaper, in the New York Times, and the main business newspaper in Moscow, and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Unfortunately, it turned out there were no good guys, just bad guys. And instead of opening a criminal case against the bad guys, they started pursuing all of my lawyers. At this point, I had 7 lawyers from 4 different law firms working for me, including Sergei Magnitsky. I became extremely worried for my lawyers, and so I asked each of them to leave Russia, come to London at my expense, and stay in London at my expense to get out of harm's way. And it wasn't an easy conversation to have, but eventually 6 of the 7 lawyers came out and are here. But the one who refused to leave was Sergei. Sergei Magnitsky was a idealist, a young idealist. He was in his mid-30s. And Sergei said, I've not broken any laws. Why should I leave? The law will protect me if they arrest me. And he went on to say that the people who did this crime should be the ones who are in trouble, not any of us. And so he stayed, and he testified against the officials and the officers who had done the raid. And 1 month after his testimony, the same officers arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes. In December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up and the stench would be unbearable. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night, put him in with crazy people and all sorts of stuff. And after about 6 months of this, he ended up getting very sick. He lost 20 kilos, developed terrible pains in his stomach, and was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, they came to him and said, if you sign this false confession saying you stole the 230 million, then your conditions will improve. And Sergei, who is a man of great integrity and principle, said, I'm not signing any false confessions. And as a result, they then abruptly moved him from a prison that had a hospital to a prison called Butyrka, which is a maximum security prison, a medieval prison, one of the toughest in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, there were no medical facilities there at all. At Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing, ear-piercing pain, and they refused him all medical treatment. He and his lawyers applied on 20 different occasions for medical treatment, and every single one of his requests was either ignored or denied. And finally, his body could no longer handle it, and on the night of November 16th, he went into critical condition. Only then did the authorities decide that they didn't want to have him at Butyrka anymore, so they sent him by ambulance to the other prison that had a medical center. When he arrived at the other prison, instead of being put in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died. He was 37 years old. That was November 16th, 2009, 5.5 years ago. I got the call on this morning, the next morning at 7:30 in the morning, and it was by far the most painful, terrible news I've ever gotten in my life. And I made a vow then and there that I wasn't going to let the people who killed him get away with it. And for the last 5.5 years, I've effectively given up my life as a businessman to pursue justice. And I would have thought that justice would be attainable in this situation specifically because of what happened in this situation. Namely that Sergei, in addition to this mistreatment, had documented it all. Other than the last night of his life, he wrote everything down. He wrote 450 complaints documenting how he was tortured during his 358 days in detention. And unlike any other case where there's some type of plausible deniability, we knew exactly what happened to him in the most detailed and granular way. And so we figured that this must bring some justice to the situation, that even if Putin is a monster, he can throw a few mid-level people under the bus and that would be the end of the story, and we get some justice, at least for the people who tortured and killed him, if not getting the people who ordered it. Well, it turned out that we were naive and optimistic to think that there'd be any type of prosecutions at all. Instead, the Russian authorities decided to circle the wagons. They changed the cause of his death from his ailments to heart failure. They said he just died of heart failure. They said there was no signs of violence, even though there was visible bruises on his body. They said he had never discovered any crime, and they said, therefore, nobody's at fault. They exonerated everybody involved. On the 1-year anniversary of his death, they even promoted and gave special state honors to some of the most complicit officers. The only 2 people who have ever been prosecuted in this whole affair was 3 years after Sergei died, they prosecuted him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. Not even Stalin tried dead people. And they prosecuted me as his co-defendant, and I was sentenced in absentia to 9 years. So it became clear to me that there was no possibility of justice inside of Russia, so we said to ourselves, let's try to get justice outside of Russia. And we came up with this idea, which is that the people killed him for money, for a lot of money, for $230 million. And they don't like to keep their money in Russia. They like to keep it in the West. They like to buy properties in the West. They like to send their kids to school in the West. So we said if we can somehow ban them from coming to the West and freeze their assets, then it's not real justice, but it's a lot better than total impunity. So I went to the United States and I told this story to a conservative Republican senator named John McCain and a liberal Democrat senator named Benjamin Cardin, and they agreed to sponsor something called the US Magnitsky Act, which would impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. They launched it as a proposed piece of legislation in October of 2010, and immediately after they launched it, a number of members of the Russian opposition showed up in Washington, including Boris Nemtsov, whose name I'm sure you all know, who was the man who was murdered last Friday, who said, this is the most powerful thing, the most powerful tool that you could ever have come up with to deal with the kleptocrats that run our country. Please expand the legislation so it doesn't just include Sergei, but includes all the gross human rights abusers in Russia. And the senators were so compelled by this approach by Nemtsov and a few others that they added 65 words to the law to include all gross human rights abusers in Russia. The law went through lots of stages of legislative process. And I should say that the one group of people who didn't want this law passed was the US administration. President Obama had something called the Russian reset, which is his idea of trying to, I call it the Russian appeasement policy, which was the idea of just trying to talk nice with Vladimir Putin in the hopes that he would be nice back. And so for a number of years, between 2010 and 2012, the Obama administration did everything they could to block this legislation. But when it finally came up for vote, and this is what I love about democracy, it passed 92-4 in the Senate and 89% of the House of Representatives. And there's no way, regardless of reset or not, that Obama could in any way stand in the way of this law. And it became a federal law in 2012. And there are now 34 people who are on the US Magnitsky list. And then we came up with the idea we need it in Europe. And so here's a book called Why Europe Needs a Magnitsky Law. And in fact, Boris Nemtsov's essay is in here along with a bunch of other people's essays. And Europe is even a bigger and more important place than the US as far as the Russians are concerned. They're constantly traveling to London and to the south of France and to various other things. And we were able to get the European Parliament as exercised as we got the US Congress. And they in last year, they voted unanimously in favor of a Magnitsky Act. But we've still been unable to get the European Union to do it for the same reasons that we had trouble with Obama. And unlike the US, where there's a very strong separation of powers, where the Congress can actually pass laws that the president has to abide by, the European Parliament can't do that in Europe. And so that's the next step of my campaign. So in addition to the political part of my campaign, there's what I call the communications part of my campaign. In order to get stuff done, one needs to have the world know about this story. And my original thoughts were to go to newspapers to tell the story, thinking if I could get a big story in the Financial Times or wherever, then people will understand how terrible it is, and lots more people will join my cause, and we'll get all these sanctions passed and other good things. And then I learned something a little bit frustrating, which is that very, very few people read the Financial Times. And if you're lucky enough to have gotten something into the Financial Times that very few people read, the likelihood that somebody will actually have read your article is even less. And how much time do people spend on an article in the Financial Times? Probably about 45 seconds per article. And so it didn't change anything. Putting things in the Financial Times gets stuff on the record, but it doesn't change anything because of this 45-second thing. So then we started working with YouTube. We started making these 10-minute YouTube videos about how rich some of the conspirators got, these police officers, how they had multi-million-dollar houses and so on and so forth. And those 10-minute YouTube videos were actually much more powerful than any Financial Times article. And we got 2.5 million downloads of our YouTube videos, which were very powerful. But that was still only 10 minutes of somebody's time. And then I came to the conclusion and the realization that if I could write a book and people read the book and they read it from start to finish, then you get like 10 to 12 hours of their time. And so I set out to write this book called Red Notice. And I made sure, and this was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, much harder than passing a law or starting a hedge fund. I had to write this book so that people would finish it. People would finish it and they'd want to hand it off to their friends. And so I agonized and agonized. And I spent 2 years writing this book. And I succeeded. I succeeded in getting a book written that I promise you, if any of you have time today, if you have studies that you have to do, don't do this, but read the first 10 pages of this book, because once you read the first 10 pages, you won't be able to stop until you finish. And so the book is now 4 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That's on the Sunday Times bestseller list. As I even learned today, it's on the New Zealand bestseller list. And by telling this story, and the book basically proves, without any question, that the Russian regime is a criminal regime where right up to the president of Russia, where they steal money and kill people for that, and they're all involved. And so my job is to get the story out as far and as wide as I can for Sergei. And the last part of my whole campaign, so this is not the end of it, is to make the Hollywood movie from the book, because then everyone will know the story. And hopefully one day, in a few years' time, you'll be able to go to the cinema and watch as some famous Hollywood star plays me in this whole story. So that is my prepared, or not really prepared, my unprepared remarks. But now I guess we have Q&A, or...
Thank you, Bill. I'd like to second Bill's perception as an author, that he really created a page turner here. From the moment I got the book, I couldn't put it down. I stayed up until I'd reached the end, and that's very rare for me, particularly for anything that's not on my curriculum. So I highly, highly recommend it. Now, I'm sure you all have lots of questions. We have someone here with a microphone, and so if you can raise your hand, I'll recognize you, and she'll come with a microphone.
Don't be shy.
Yes?
Hi, thanks for your very interesting talk. I was wondering, you said that in the period 2000-2004, you and Putin were on the same side in a way. Sorry. You said in the... There we go. You said in the period 2000-2004, you and Putin were on the same side in the fight against the oligarchs. I wonder what you made of the economic policies of Putin in that early era, where there were these push for economic reforms and for the more rule of law and for reforms of the business environment, pushed by people like the liberals like Greff and those kind of characters. I wonder whether you thought that was cosmetic or whether there was real moves there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in my estimation, Putin has been a number of different people. I mean, he's always been the same guy, but he's had to be a different person dealing with different constraints at different parts of his presidency. So when Putin first came to power, he was very tentative. He wasn't sure how to exercise power in Russia. Part of it was because some of the power had been stolen from him, and part of it was because there was a democracy before him. Yeltsin had created a democracy, and so he had to deliver something to the people. And so I believe genuinely that these liberals and some of the liberal economic policies that he, and Putin had a number of things that I can remember giving presentations in the year 2001 and 2002, showing all these great liberal economic policies that he was putting in place and praising him for them, because they really were. And the reason he was doing that was because he wanted the love of the people so that he could then consolidate his power. And so he was a genuinely sort of, in the early parts of his presidency, he was a genuinely sort of nationally interested president, acting in the national interest. As he was slowly sort of bringing back all the levers of power to the presidency. Now, I've never studied Zimbabwe, but people have told me that Mugabe in the very early days wasn't a terrible guy. He just became terrible. And I don't know, maybe he was, I might be insulting some Zimbabweans here by saying he wasn't never terrible, but I don't think that Putin was acting all that terribly in the early stages, with the exception of the way he was dealing with Chechnya, which a lot of people including myself, didn't pay attention to, partially because the Chechen thing was so ugly on both sides that it was easy to just sort of say it's all just terrible, let's just put it in its own separate box. So I think that to a certain extent he was okay. When he didn't, so basically once he won his war with the oligarchs, instead of creating a normal country without oligarchs, he just became the biggest oligarch, and that's when he went off the rails. And there's an expression that you've all heard: absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I think that's what's happened with Putin now.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Jordan. I'm from Indonesia. I witnessed similar stories in my country. But fortunately, what we have is that we have a functioning democratic system and accountability, so we could sort of chase down all the criminals and recover all the assets corrupted. I'm just curious about your vision. I mean, you really into storytelling. I think that's really powerful, and that's the way to go. What's your ultimate objective of this? Are you really just chasing down the officials who persecuted and stole the money from Sergei, or you actually are after Putin? And which definitely requires a bigger strategy here. And what do you think of it? Thanks.
I'm looking for justice. So I've got two agendas, which are nothing to do with Putin. Justice for Sergei Magnitsky specifically. So I want the people who killed him to go to jail in Russia for murder. And all this stuff of asset freezes is just an intermediate step. And the second thing I want is a lasting legacy, so that they ultimately build monuments for Sergei Magnitsky for his bravery and for his patriotism. And this book is sort of my intermediate step of a literary monument for that. Now, I don't believe that we're going to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky while Putin is still in power. And his demise is a prerequisite for that, but I'm way too small and powerless to ever attempt or hope that I could have anything to do with his leaving power. But I would be the first person cheering the moment he loses his power.
Thank you for your talk. I'm curious from a technical point of view. You said that Sergei documented everything that happened to him in the prison, and you also said that he had lawyers. But how easy was it getting hold of that documentation and finding out what happened to him? Did you have to fight for that information, or was it given to you? That's
a very good question. So intuitively, you would think that they wouldn't let any paper out of prison because they'd be so afraid of them. But interestingly, Russia is a very, very procedurally oriented, bureaucratic country where they absolutely are completely slaves to their procedure. And it's such a corrupt country that they don't care what information is out there because it has no consequence. And so, and this is, if you read Bukovsky or Solzhenitsyn or any of these people, it's a part of, certainly with Bukovsky, it was sort of like an exercise of the dissident to write complaints from jail. And so you can write as many complaints as you want. And Sergei would write them by hand, and he was a lawyer, he knew the Russian the criminal procedure code, and he would find the violations every day, sometimes twice a day, and write a complaint. And his lawyer, by procedure, was allowed to visit him once a month, and so he would then take a stack of these things, they'd file them, the complaints would be ignored or rejected, and we get copies of them. And so we now have what I would describe as the modern-day Gulag archipelago of Russia, which is these 450 complaints from Sergei Magnitsky.
On the side, in the gray, without the Mickey Mouse.
Thank you.
Mickey Mouse doesn't get it?
It's just a brief question regarding, so you mentioned sanctions and the adoption of list. So as you have a great experience of the Russian political life, to what extent? Because there are two arguments. On the one hand, it's effective in a sense that it decreases incentives to support Putin and his administration. And on the other hand, it enables Putin and its administration to create narratives to undermine the opposition.
I'm sorry, just help me repeat your question.
Yeah, so how do you assess the effectiveness of sanctions, such as list? Because on the one hand, it's effective because it's decreased incentives to support Putin because it has cost. But on the other hand, it provides with the regime to undermine the opposition, to say, you see, they are teaming up with the enemy of Russia.
Well, both of those are true. So the sanctions are highly effective. And I know they're effective because of Putin's reaction to the sanctions, which were to ban adoptions of American families of Russian children and to prosecute Sergei posthumously, which shows that he's really terrified of those sanctions. And why is he terrified of the sanctions? For one simple reason, because before the sanctions, he could give instructions to the 10,000 people carrying out his criminal orders, and everyone would do so without any hesitation because there was no bad consequences to doing that. After the sanctions, he can't guarantee absolute impunity. And so, and it's very interesting because I've met people who have been in prison while while all this sanction stuff was going on, and they're saying that as a result of our campaign, the prison conditions improved in Russia because everyone was afraid of being, the authorities were afraid of having another Sergei Magnitsky. You're also right about the narrative of them painting the pictures of the opposition as being, in collusion with the West. But it almost doesn't matter because they're going to paint they say everything about the opposition. And just to give you an example, they have this television station called NTV, and they do these things. They did a program called Anatomy of a Protest, where they sort of go in and sort of blackmail or try to discredit the opposition. And they were going to run Anatomy of the Protest 3 on Sunday night, this last Sunday, which was about Boris Nemtsov. And after they killed him, I guess they decided they achieved their goals through other means. But they're doing everything possible to destroy the opposition, so it doesn't really matter what their narrative is.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech. I just was like, you mentioned at the during the 2000-2004 period that Putin kind of gained more control over the oligarchy, like by building a compact with them and by kind of taking some of their assets and stuff like that. Like, now that with the Ukraine crisis, with the decline in oil prices, the economic decline, do you feel that there's in some way like Putin's regime has been described as like almost like by Luke Harding and others like a synthesis between like FSB power, oligarchical power, and his own personal power and his dominance? Do you feel that there could be some kind of a rupture now with economic decline and some oligarchs could potentially defect from the regime and represent an opposition force in their own right?
That's a question people ask me a lot. Can the oligarchs, will there be an oligarch coup? And the answer is 0% probability. Why? Because the oligarchs used to have power. How do they have power? Part of it was because they privatized police forces to arrest people on their instructions. And so whoever has the power to arrest people has ultimate power in Russia. Putin now has the power to arrest people. And so if you're an oligarch and you're worth $10 billion, you can be arrested, you can be stuck in jail, and all your assets can be taken away. And so you're not going to there's no way you're ever even going to contact. Every oligarch is just sitting there, just praying and hoping that crossing their fingers and just keeping their head down and hoping that no one's going to come and notice them and take their stuff away. And they're of course they're angry that everything is worth half as much as it was before. But there's no way they'll ever uprise and do anything. There's that lady in the back has been
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for your talk. By listening to your story and looking at the news, I feel the nature of Russia. It's a bit direct question, but have you had life-threatening experience in your life? Or haven't you been scared of potential danger that you will face after you decided to?
Let me read you a little passage at the end of the book just to answer that question. I think this is 1 second. I have to assume that there's a very real chance that Putin or members of his regime will have me killed someday. Like anyone else, I have no death wish, and I have no intention of letting them kill me. I can't mention most of the countermeasures I take, but I will mention this book. If I'm killed, you'll know who did it. When my enemies read this book, they will know that you know. So if you sympathize with this search for justice or with Sergei's tragic fate, please share this story with as many people as you can. That simple act will keep the spirit of Sergei Magnitsky alive and go further than an army of bodyguards in keeping me safe. So. Mickey Mouse gets it, finally.
Thank you, Bill. I was sitting here listening to you talk thinking, Putin clearly has got all the money he ever wanted. He's got all the power. What's his end game?
Well, that's also a good question. So,
what's Vladimir Putin's end game? He's got all the money, all the power. Does he have an exit plan?
So, so the way it worked was he originally started by being a sort of democratic president who tried to get all the people back of him, and he was genuinely popular at the very beginning. Then he started getting scared, thinking that at some point he won't be all that popular, and he needed money. And so after the oligarchs, after Khodorkovsky was arrested, he then started to do serious stealing, from, taking all these oligarchs' money and stealing from the state on a massive scale. And when he started, and I've seen this because I know I manage money for a long period of time for a lot of very rich people. Money becomes a very sort of obsessive, compulsive thing. And once you start making it, you want to make more, and that's what so he's been in this situation where he just got greedier and greedier and greedier and took more and more money. And the more money he took, the more difficult it ever became that he could ever enjoy that money, because lives had been ruined, people arrested, all this kind of stuff. And so he ended up in a position probably like 5 or 6 years ago where he has no exit strategy. There's no way of exiting. To exit would mean that he would be arrested, all of his money taken away, and he'd probably be killed. And so without an exit strategy, then he has to think about how does he stay in power. And things were going fine as the economy was going up and people were getting better off, but now the economy has started going down. And so he's no longer maximizing profits anymore. Now he's just purely thinking about survival and staying in power, which is equal to survival. And he's not thinking long term. He doesn't have a strategy. All he thinks about is survival tactics. And the war in Ukraine is one of the biggest survival tactics there is. You can't run a kleptocracy and steal hundreds of billions of dollars for yourself and let people not have medicine in hospitals and not be taught in schools for that long before 140 million Russians rise up and don't want you there anymore. And so he needed to do something to keep everybody distracted and change the narrative. And so the narrative he created was that the Ukrainians are fascist Nazis, that they're backed by the West, and that they're going to ethnically cleanse Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, which made everybody pretty angry in Russia. You don't want your brothers and sisters ethnically cleansed by these fascist Nazis. And the word fascist and Nazi has great connotation in Russia because they lost 20 million people fighting the fascists and Nazis in the Second World War. And so they created this propaganda campaign, breakfast, lunch, and dinner all day, all night on television. And then they went and invaded Crimea, and his approval ratings jumped to 88%. And so, but he can't just stop there because of all these brothers and sisters that are about to be ethnically cleansed. And so he needs to carry on with this international enemy strategy. And unfortunately, the end game is some type of really ugly war. I mean, I think that there are two options for the future for Europe and for Russia. One of the options is Cold War, which everyone says they want to avoid. But the only other option is a hot war, which is even more, which we should all desire to avoid even more, where there's no status quo to go back to in Russia. And so this whole thing is effectively all comes back to this whole oligarchs and then Putin becoming the oligarch and all this stolen money and then trying to distract everybody. And that's what the whole thing is about. And it could ultimately, his kleptocracy could ultimately lead us to a world war if it doesn't get played out properly.
So we'll start with the other fellow on the couch.
Thank you. I was wondering, what indications do we have of how much money Putin personally has and where he keeps it?
Credit Suisse. No, I'm just joking. Putin doesn't have his name on any account or any property in any register anywhere in the world, because if he did, then that would be compromised information which could then be used against him. He's a typical FSB guy. The way he holds his assets is in verbal trust agreements with oligarchs. And so when you see certain oligarchs being said to be worth $12 billion or $15 billion, multiply that number by a half, that's how much the oligarch is worth, and then take the other half, and that's what belongs to Putin. And so if you do that math in very simple terms, the top 100 oligarchs are worth 400 billion. You could then say, using those assumptions, that he's worth 200 billion. It may be more because it's not just oligarch money that he's got. He also is involved in like pipeline scams, Sochi Olympics. Nemtsov estimated that 30 billion was stolen from the building of the Sochi Olympics. He obviously got some of that. Nobody knows the exact number, but it's probably the largest theft in the history of the world.
But isn't it, to a certain extent, an abstraction how much he has if he can't use it currently, and if there's no legal title to it, so if he falls from power? can't use it. And
You're thinking exactly the way he's thinking. So you, yeah, you're right. So he falls from power and he calls up, XYZ oligarch and says, "Hey, I need some of my money." And the guy said, "Vladimir who?" So of course you're right. And so he can't fall from power.
but he can't use it while he's in power either. So why have it in the first place?
Well, that's a very logical thing. Maybe we should just tell him that.
So the next will be George, and right after that, the fellow to his left. George.
Stand up. Oh, yeah, sure. Hi, I'm George Bogdan. I'm a DPhil in International Relations. I was very interested at the end of your talk when you started to explain how you're engaging in advocacy work. One thing I've been truly shocked by is after having watched the PBS Frontline documentary about Putin that came out just a few weeks ago, I forwarded it to 40 people, and they all kind of said, "Oh, well, I'd heard part of the story before. I guess he did actually engage in the apartment bombing, et cetera, et cetera." But there was no kind of response that was visceral, and I was sort of shocked by it. And what seems to me to be at the center of your approach is this desire to create a narrative. And so I'm wondering about how important you think that is, and where that will play a role in seeing the change take place that you hope to advance.
Well, nothing ever happens by itself. No matter how shocked people are by the PBS documentary, somebody needs to then say, "I want to go do something about that." I mean, it's like in market, someone says, something is undervalued. If something is so cheap, why doesn't everyone buy it? Because someone hasn't bought it yet until they do. And the same thing is true in a terrible, atrocities. Why doesn't someone do something about that? Because there's nobody there to do something about it until someone decides there is something to do about it. And that's. But the other thing I would say is that, and I've learned this from my own experience, is in the power of storytelling. Why did the Magnitsky Act become law when there's literally millions of victims like Sergei Magnitsky? And the answer is because his story is such a shocking story, and I know how to tell his story. And I would say that if there's like one sort of takeaway, no matter what field of study you're in, whatever your chosen profession is after you finish studying here, every bit of success in life comes down to if you can tell a story. And if you don't know how to tell a story, you should learn how to tell a story. It's all about telling a story. And I was able to tell this story to these senators. I was able to tell a story at the European Parliament and tell a story to journalists. And as a result, something changed in the world. And it all comes down to the story and the narrative. And of course, it has to be a good story. You can't have a bad story, but a good story changes everything.
Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, sure. My name's Jonathan. I'm a student here at Oxford in Oriental Studies. So I'm curious about something which is, on one hand, Putin's actions in the Ukraine and in Crimea have sort of brought Putinism back into the world and everybody's paying attention now. And yet he's very popular in Russia. He's extremely popular in China. I was just in China for a while. There are all kinds of books that are basically like elegies to this. They call him a Ying Han, which means a hard Han, a real man. So that sort of thing is happening. And I'm just wondering, is there, on one hand, I've spent time in Russia, and you would think that Russia and, let's say, the United States or Europe eventually do have some kind of a common friendship to be had. And I'm wondering if what Putin has been doing recently is going to create permanent damage to, let's say, U.S.-Russia relations that sort of goes deeper and beyond his own actions. It's not just Putinism. Is it something that's going to cause a rift between Russia and the West on the level of, peoples? As you've said, you said something like there are 140 million sort of wonderful Russians, and then there are a million of them that are, oppressing these people. Is it that, or is this going to cause damage to the possibility of some sort of future, decency between our countries?
It's very interesting. They poll Americans and they poll Russians, and right now, 80% of Russians think America is hostile, and 80% of Americans think Russia is hostile. But 5 years ago, it was like 20%. Right now, Putin's got a quote 88% approval rating. But what are you going to say on the phone if you live in Russia and a stranger calls you up and says, "Do you support Putin?" I think this is all very, I mean, a good leader and a good relationship and decent situation can lead to, these numbers turning around very dramatically. I don't think there's anything permanent about anything, unless, unless the Russians or Putin commits some type of unforgivable atrocity that we just can't put away. But I don't believe that any of this stuff is unfixable.
With the white scarf.
Thank you. Do you want me to stand? Is that better? I'm a human rights trainer, first and foremost, and I'm just interested in how you would break down. I'm listening to you here describe and explore, and lots of people have made some comments here, which makes you more aware of just how big a nut this is to crack. And I'm hearing a very good strategy, by the way, about how the external relations and the foreign policy is integral to your pitch and the action you want to see. I'm also thinking about the people on the ground who live in Russia. And we've seen people such as Pussy Riot, etc., people who've campaigned to change things, and we've seen the shocking things that have happened to people in Greenpeace. But ultimately, the people in the country have to be the ones that want to see the change that they would like to live with and see. And how do we empower them? How do we give them the courage and the strength to take that on board and really see the change that they want without it taking, the sort of external pressures that it might take a very, very long time? So what's your strategy on the ground?
Well, I mean, this may sound self-serving, but what are our options? It used to be that the US and the EU would give money to some NGOs about democracy and blah, 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 and now the Russians block that by calling them foreign agents, and they're not allowed to take that money. So, and this is coming back to my Magnitsky law. That's the only thing that we can do to help them, because if we can create a punishment for people misbehaving in Russia, then maybe they won't misbehave as badly towards the people who are trying to change Russia. That's the only, and I've had Pussy Riot with me on Capitol Hill. I've had Alexei Navalny fighting for this. I've had every person who's involved in trying to change Russia supporting this, because it's the only policy. If these guys are crooks and kleptocrats that want to do bad things at home and then travel abroad, let's at least not let them travel abroad. That's one thing we can do from abroad. At the end of the day, the other thing we can do very harshly, the other thing we can do, which I think is not so harsh, I mean it's harsh, but it's not so terrible for the Russian people, is let's freeze the assets in the West of the top 100 oligarchs. Because the money is so concentrated that you get everybody, all the bad guys, in one fell swoop by freezing their money in the West. Now, what does affect everybody is the sanctions that are currently in place, which means that there's an economic crisis going on, which I don't think is the best way of doing this stuff, but I think that you kind of have to try everything, and that's what they're doing. But I'd come back to say that if you can create consequences for evil behavior on the ground through targeted sanctions on people who commit crimes on the ground, that's a good place to start.
The young woman in the chair.
Hello, I'm Catherine. I'm an MPhil in Russian and East European Studies here. And you've said that you don't agree with the sort of 80% approval ratings for Putin as kind of a genuine reflection of his popularity, but there does appear to be pretty unanimous consent among sort of scholars and commentators that Putin is genuinely popular among Russians. How do you think he's managed to maintain this? Do you think it's all propaganda, or is he doing something that Russians really do like?
You're right. He's not unpopular. But let's just look at some of the facts before we decide that he's got an 88. I mean, let's try. So where were these? Were the same 88% of the people who given the approval rating the ones at the bank trying to convert their rubles to dollars? Because you can't be a person fully approving of a president if you're like panicking at the bank, staying up all night trying to convert your rubles to dollars. Just those two things don't equal. And so. The second thing I would say is that you're right. So what do you do? So Putin is now doing this propaganda stuff to try to get everybody riled up, and the propaganda stuff works until it doesn't work. And so I would say that he's in a much more precarious position now than he ever has been, because he was always the good economy president. For 10 years, the economy was slowly grinding up, and his whole pitch to the Russian people was, we don't want to go back to the days of crisis. If you've studied Russian stuff, you'll know that that's the case. It's always, we don't like that crisis stuff. We're stability people. And all of a sudden, he's created a crisis, and a crisis which no one's going to know. People haven't paid attention to him creating it, but they will pay attention, the worse this crisis gets, to their own standard of living. And if they're hungry, if they're getting laid off, if things are expensive, if they're having a hard time with something, people will eventually start saying, well, the government should fix this. And if the government doesn't fix it, then he's got a problem on his hands. And I don't know how it's going to happen, and it may not happen, but what could happen, and what he's scared of having happen, which is the reason why he's scared of the opposition right now, is he's scared that there's going to be some flashpoint. Like in Tunisia, you had a guy who was being given a hard time by the police over something, a fruit vendor, it sets himself on fire, and all of a sudden the regime falls. And that's what Putin's afraid of. And it's brittle. It's a brittle regime. You can have all the propaganda he wants, and then all of a sudden, he might even be overthrown by an even more hardcore guy than himself. Nobody knows. You don't know. I don't know. He doesn't know.
Person next to you.
Thank you. I'm Declan Johnson. I'm a student of Russian Eastern European Studies as well. Just wondering if I could push back on this idea of Putin's primary motivation being self-enrichment. Is it not to a certain extent a bit sort of flippant to say that that is his primary motivation? I mean, this is someone who has spent 12 years talking about investing all of his efforts and all of his every policy he's created towards the direction of strengthening the state and creating stability after the 1990s. And if his primary motivation was money, he could have done things like stayed as head of the FSB. I mean, those were positions that you could enrich yourself from. I've no doubt, and I'm not sort of excusing Putin for anything he does, and I have no doubt that he is involved in all sorts of financial dealings that are not exactly sanitary. But I would argue that his primary motivation is to lift Russia up from the years of instability and to create and his primary motivation is towards state strengthening, rather than personal enrichment. I'd say you could say that about, say, Yanukovych in Ukraine, but not necessarily about Putin.
Well, I have a different point of view. My point of view is based on an personal experience I had where there was, it all comes down to Magnitsky. So here's a guy who discovered $230 million stolen from the Russian state. So if Putin gave a shit about the Russian state, why would he not prosecute the people who stole the $230 million?
I would say that he has his primary motivation in terms of dealing with the oligarchs.
But these aren't oligarchs.
It was to rein in people who were rich and powerful and could threaten the stability of the state. As he saw when he came, he saw Yeltsin as being somewhat undermined by extraordinarily rich people within the state, and he's very indulgent of people who make money illegally because they support and prop up his regime. But I wouldn't say that is his personal motivation.
Okay, so let's take this one step further. So this Magnitsky thing blew up. Mm-hmm. Okay, a bunch of guys killed Magnitsky, the patriot, the guy who was cared about the money of the state, and then Putin protected those guys to the point where the United States Congress passed a law sanctioning Russia. He could have prosecuted any of those guys. If he was interested in the state, why would he have not prosecuted 6 Interior Ministry officers? Why would he have not done that? And instead have international sanctions imposed on his country for the first time in 35 years, if he cared about his state?
I would agree that obviously would have been the best thing in the long
term.
No,
but it's not. So why didn't he do that? Coming back to your thesis.
Because he needs the support of people within his own interior ministry and to strengthen that institution. To
do what? Steal the money?
To create stability within the state. But that does obviously allow people to then
steal
money.
So they've stolen all the money, so the state doesn't function. The hospitals don't work, the schools don't work, the roads don't work.
But arguably now, schools and hospitals do work a lot greater than they did under Yeltsin. People are getting salaries. Now people aren't no longer getting salaries have risen. They're getting paid on time, which they weren't.
Well, so 90% of the money goes to Putin, 10% goes to the state, and it's not working. I mean, if you go to ask any Russian what happens when you go to the hospital, do you get proper treatment, or do you have to pay for it out of your own pocket, etc. This is not a state. It's a hollowed out country where 90% of the money has been stolen, 10% has been. It's just it doesn't work. Your thesis that he's a statesman doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of this story, just because of the story. Everything else is plausibly in your camp. You can say, yes, there's a lot of bad people and he's a good man. But the Magnitsky story, and the reason why he hates the Magnitsky story so much is because this story proves the opposite. It proves that you're wrong.
I think we'll leave it at that. One more question. We have time for one more question, if any. Stand up. Someone who hasn't asked a question.
Hi, my name's Christian. I'm studying for a bachelor's in history. I was wondering what you think of sort of the equivocation of some European Union leaders over economic sanctions, and how legitimate do you think economic concerns can sort of trump the greater moral imperative, obviously, of taking action against the Russian state?
You know, this is the real question that's going on right now. So you've got all these countries in Europe that don't want trouble with Russia. Why don't they want trouble with Russia? Because they have good business with Russia. I was just in France yesterday, and they want to sell a bunch of warships. They have a couple $2 billion worth of warships. They don't want to get stuck on their own books. The Germans are doing lots of business with the Russians. Here in the UK, the real estate agents are selling houses to the Russians, and the City of London is listing Russian companies. And there's this psychology, which is that it's going to cost this much to if we sanction Russia. It's an amount. It's $1 billion or $10 billion or $500 million, depending on the country or whatever the situation is, and that's quantifiable. But what they can't quantify, and what nobody has been able to quantify, is if we don't sanction Russia, what increase in our defense budget are we going to be forced on a percentage of GDP basis to be borne by the whole country, not just by a small group of business people, when Russia turns into what it's already turned into, which is that they're buzzing our airspace, they're invading foreign countries, they're challenging NATO, they're putting out maps of all the places they can strike with their nuclear weapons, and so it's sort of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking, and you're absolutely right, and you have to add to this equation one other thing, which is there are some corrupt heads of state in this whole mixture of the 28 members of the EU who are actually getting money or being compromised personally by Putin.
Bill, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on.